I need to return to that problem of the dirty word of atheism. As I said, sometimes it's hard to be an atheist. I think this is a stumbling block for any historian wishing to assess non-belief over time. Paine himself is a case in point. As we've seen, Paine was lambasted by the American press and the British press for being a revolting atheist. But the fact is that he was not actually a non-believer. As he said in that controversial book, The Age of Reason, quote, "I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life." Paine was like many of his American and French revolutionary and Republican contemporaries. He was a deist. He believed in a God of reason, a divine watchmaker who created an ordered, rational universe. Certainly this was not the God of the barbarous Gospels, but to be sure, it was a very real God nonetheless. The same can be said of Paine's radical contemporaries in England, most famous of which, of course, are Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, who were likewise not godless Republicans, as their critics accused them of being. For Godwin in particular, his ultra-Calvinist upbringing was deeply important to his worldview, if only because he forcefully rejected it and adopted the opposite spiritual position of the moral and physical perfectibility of mankind in this life, an idea which eventually led him to claim that it would be possible for the human race to become immortal. And I think that claim, which is, as I say, is one that probably a lot of us find difficult to stomach, really reveals the way in which a lot of the political thought, radical political thought in the late 18th century had a kind of millenarian, visionary quality to it, spiritual and mystical quality to it. And obviously that comes through most forcefully in William Blake's paintings, engravings and poetry as well. But it's a general feature of a lot of late 18th century radical thought. The same, I think, is true if we go back to an earlier generation of radicals, to my specialist period, the 17th century, and radical groups like the Levellers and the Diggers. These were individuals of deep religious convictions. John Lilburn and Richard Overton were both Baptists. William Wallen was an independent, a Congregationalist. The Digger leader Gerard Winstanley was really too unique in his religious views to characterise in any particular way, but certainly in his later life he became an active member of the Society of Friends. He became a Quaker. And these individuals, so critical, particularly the Levellers, in terms of the debate on religious toleration in this country, argued for that toleration in large part because of their religious convictions. Partly out of self-interest, they wanted to protect their own religious beliefs and activities from prosecution, but also because they thought that stifling religious debate, stifling religious expression would prevent people from hearing divine truth, would prevent people from having access to divine revelation. I think a famous example of this, and not usually thought in this way, at least outside of academic circles, is John Milton's Areopagitica, which is mostly known as a kind of anti-censorship tract, even though it actually only deals with pre-publication censorship, not post-publication censorship. But Milton's argument there really is that censorship is bad because it relies on fallible human censors to determine what's divine truth and what's error. And actually it's better to let error come out so that you can also have divine truth coming out at the same time, and people being able to access that. Even when we move into the modern period, and this is when, certainly in the 19th century, and a number of historians have seen a kind of antagonistic relationship between, say, nonconformity and popular radicalism, the religious taproot of radicalism remained important. For a Chartist like John Watkins, Chartism was, quote, a second Christianity. Christians, he said, must be Charterists. So here we kind of get the People's Charter as a sort of 19th century version of the Beatitudes, though presumably according to the Gospel of Luke rather than to the Gospel of Matthew. The recovery of Paine himself from early 19th century pariah figure to a viable radical figurehead also had its religious causes. The rediscovery of his works, the rehabilitation of his reputation, owed much to the work of Unitarians, particularly in the United States. His first serious biographer, Moncur D. Conway, encountered Paine through actually German immigrants in Cincinnati, his hometown, who celebrated Paine as a fellow free thinker and had read Paine's Age of Reason in German translation. And this inspired him then to look again at Paine and develop his biography of Paine, from which so much subsequent work has been developed. So what I'm not doing in this talk is trying to look for, if you like, humanist or atheist or agnostic predecessors. That's very difficult for historians, because it's very hard to find people who declare themselves to be these things. And given the centrality of religion to culture in the early modern period, in the medieval period, it's very hard to see ways in which people could break free from a religiously saturated worldview. So I think there are the same problems there in terms of trace of genealogy, if you like, of humanism or atheism, as there are for trying to trace the genealogy of socialism and look back to, say, Win Stanley as a proto-communist or socialist. But I think, nonetheless, paradoxically, bringing religion back into the story of British radicalism helps us understand how we get to the point where 43% of the British public feel free to express the opinion that they don't believe in God, how we move to this point of having that much freedom of expression and freedom of conscience. And in talking about those connections between religious culture in this country and the development of liberty, I'm mainly talking about here dissent and nonconformity, using those terms broadly. We can, of course, find examples of Anglican radicals. The hero of Peterloo, Henry Orator Hunt, is one notable example of just one such Anglican radical. But the connections between reform and dissent have historically been a great deal stronger. Now that's not surprising, given the strong links between the state and the state church. Since the medieval period, the Church of England has acted as the propagandizing mouthpiece and intellectual crutch of first personal monarchy and then constitutional monarchy. In the period that I work on, the Elizabethan homilies provided a storehouse of sermons which parish priests could trot out at points of crisis to remind their parishioners of the evils of rebellion, itself equated with a kind of anti-religion. Cranmer's text calls it as the sin of witchcraft. Rebellion is the sin of witchcraft. So being rebellious is the same thing as being anti-Christian. And on the flip side, emphasising that Christian duty of obedience. And that political role of the church, explicitly political role of the church, continues well into the modern period. It doesn't dissipate with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And just to give you an example of this, there's a research project going on at the University of Durham at the moment into state prayers and days of fast and humiliation and Thanksgiving. These are national days appointed in the church for Thanksgiving and fasting. Now, a lot of these are to do with non-political matters. There are a lot of days of state prayer for getting us out of trouble with various diseases, mainly cholera, obviously cheaper than clean water and efficient sewerage to have a state prayer. But there are also a number of state prayers which have clear political ramifications to them. For example, prayer ordered 24th of December 1830 on account of the troubled state of certain parts of the United Kingdom to be used as soon as received by the minister. 1830 was the year of the Captain Swing riots in southern England. This was a wave of brick burning, machine burning in southern England by agricultural labourers who were angry, desperate about the way in which mechanisation had put them on the employment scrap heap. Similarly, 1848, prayer for the maintenance of public peace and tranquility for Good Friday and 4 succeeding Sundays. 1848, of course, a year of revolution across Europe, and in Britain, the year of the mass rally at Kennington Common by the Chartists. So the church has continued to act as a mouthpiece, a propaganding mouthpiece for the state well into the modern period. And we continue to have these fast days, although they've changed the title of them to make them seem kind of non-denominational. They continue to carry on into the present day. In a less overtly political sense, the church monopolised public life in this country. Office holding was predominantly an Anglican preserve because of a variety of tests designed to weed out dissenters and Catholics. And this also filtered through into, most prominently, the education system, where the church had a monopoly until the 18th century. And this was identified by radicals such as Godwin as part of a system of social control. Godwin described the Sunday schools promoted by conservative moralists such as Wilberforce and Moore as teaching only, quote, a superstitious veneration for the Church of England and how to bow to every man in a handsome coat, end quote. So this connection between nonconformity and radicalism is easy to understand when we see that the church was usually seen, certainly by radicals, as an engine of social and political control, as an obstacle in the path of individuals exercising both their political and religious freedom. And religious freedom was vital if men, and much later women, were going to become independent political agents. And that conclusion is evident from the moment that religious toleration came to be seriously debated in England, which was during the civil wars of the 1640s. It's no coincidence that the leading Leveller writers, John Lilburne, Richard Overton, William Wallin, all cut their controversialist teeth, if you like, in those earlier debates of religious freedom before they came to be described as Levellers. And that debate in the mid-1640s is very important because it's here that we see a significant change in the way in which people talk about toleration. Religious toleration in terms of agreements based on expediency and pragmatism were common in a Europe that had been divided religiously, confessionally by the Reformation. The most famous example of this is the Edict of Nantes in France as a way of kind of ending the mass bloodletting after the French Wars of Religion. But those were really just sort of truces. They didn't acknowledge the right to believe in a different way of say, the Protestants in France. They were truces designed to prevent further blood loss, to prevent further civil unrest. There's a real difference here with the arguments being made by these English Levellers. In their arguments, they could extend toleration to not only Catholics, which in the context of the 1640s was pretty radical itself, but also even to those people who, as Wallin said, were so mistaken as not to believe in a God at all. So they were moving the boundaries here and saying, actually, this is something that all human beings have a right to. And as a consequence of this, you'll find that states are more peaceful, they become more economically productive, and so forth. Now that demand for freedom of conscience then becomes one of the most consistent, the most consistent demand in the Levellers' proto-constitutions, the agreements of the people.